All right, we're going to go ahead and talk about physical and chemical changes. So what is a physical change? Oops. A physical change alters the form of a substance but does not change it to another substance. So in other words, when you have something and it changes form, okay, or phase, it is a physical change. But when it changes form or phase, but it is not changed in itself. In other words, like if you take an orange and you juice it, it becomes orange juice. Well, the composition of the orange hasn't changed. It's just changed form from being a solid piece of an orange to being a liquid form of orange juice. That is a physical change. A chemical change is when a substance will undergo some sort of chemical change where you're changing one thing to another thing. So one thing with the certain physical and chemical properties to a different thing with certain chemical and physical properties. So an example would be baking a cake. So you start with all these different ingredients that all have their own individual physical and chemical properties, and you combine them into this cake. Now that cake, that fully baked cake, now has its own physical and chemical properties that are different than the ones from the ingredients. So that would be going through a chemical change. Oftentimes you can say a chemical change might also be like a chemical reaction. So there are some signs of chemical change. So anytime you get a color change, okay, a color change, you're seeing a chemical change. Whenever you see precipitation, you remember that means that there's a bunch of solid stuff that is at the bottom of your test tube or beaker. That is precipitation, and that could be an example of a chemical change. Precipitation. So this is the solid that forms in a solution during a chemical reaction. It looks like a cloudy solid in a clear solution. So other signs of chemical change would be gas production. So whenever you see bubbles rising to the top, that might be a sign of gas production, which would be the chemical change. Or temperature change. Obviously you go from having fireworks, which are room temperature, and then you light fire to them, and then they change temperature. They obviously get really hot in order to explode and become rockets and blast off like that. 5 signs of chemical change. So the last sign would be changes in characteristic properties. So if it smells bad or if light is given off, okay? So those are things that could tell you it's a chemical change. So let's do some practice, chemical versus physical. Cutting paper. That's a physical change because we don't change that it's paper. The paper doesn't change. It just changes form, right? It becomes, instead of one piece of paper, now 2 pieces. Ice melting. Well, the identity of the ice, which is water, doesn't change, so it is just physical. We just change form. It changes phase, so it is a physical change. Toast burning. So when toast burns, obviously the toast still comes out, but all the pieces that are burned or areas that are burned are no longer the same chemical composition. They now turn charcoaly. They taste bitter and nasty and they smell, right? So because they smell, because there's an odor change when you toast bread, you can call that a chemical change. There's also a color change if you see that. So color and smell is what you can say are the causes or the proof that there is a chemical change when toast burns. Rocket fuel burning. So you see obviously when rocket fuel burns it gives off light, and that's a big thing. It gives off light and gives off heat, both of which are huge indicators of a chemical change. And then sawing wood. So you saw one piece of wood into 2 pieces of wood. That's physical. You don't change the identity of the wood. There's none of those characteristics that indicate a chemical change, so it is a physical change. And metal rusting. So it is a color change. That is one of the big ones that tells you it's chemical change. And then disappearing puddle. So a disappearing puddle is just when it turns from being liquid water into being gaseous water, so that is a physical change. Excuse me. Candle burning. So a candle burning is there's light given off, right? There's light given off, so that is your first clue that it is a chemical change. dry ice. So when it sublimates, so when you have a certain type of ice and it sublimates into gas, that is still a physical change because the composition of the dry ice is which is a solid, is still the composition of the gas when it changes into a gas. All right, so that's physical and chemical changes. Write down any questions you have. Thanks.